Okay, this is the first of the new format for the Sheepdog Howls. To be more of a lecture format than a discussion. I'd like to get into the idea of operationalism because over the last couple of weeks, I've come to the conclusion that, let me see if I can get rid of that bell. Come to the conclusion that graceful failure is a good means to develop operational thinking. Don't expect much out of this. I think visually, I think in vectors, and I think in locations, and I think in movement through those things more so than I do in words. So I don't know if I can explain this without drawing things visually. So I'll have to try to do that on the computer, which tends to mean that I can't draw it as fast as I think, which means this could be very clunky, but hopefully not confusing. Okay, so graceful failure is a term used in programming quite often for error trapping. So if you're on an application or you're on a website and you do something wrong, there needs to be some message that's sent to the user as to what you're doing wrong. Like that's an incorrect email address, or please enter a properly formatted telephone number. Well, how we do that in programming is if you enter in an email address and it doesn't have an @ sign or a dot, when you go to submit it, we test that field for that format. And if it's incorrect, then we report that message to the user to update it. So that's called error trapping. The error is there. You want to trap it before the information is being sent anywhere. There's a number of ways of doing that, and one of them is called a try-catch, where if there is an error there, instead of reporting the message right away, we might try a few different things. So for instance, if you type in a credit card number, in the format I need for my database is to not have any spaces in it. And you type in spaces every 4 digits for your credit card number. And you try to submit that. And my error trapping goes, wait a minute, there's spaces in this number. Instead of reporting it to you right away and say, please update your credit card number or the information's incorrect, I can trap it and say, is this just a matter of spaces being in there? Yes. Let's remove the spaces and then submit it. So that's called try removing spaces, depending on what error is being caught. It's a try-catch statement. So by doing that, what we're doing is we're causing what's called graceful failure in the form. So instead of just an abrupt break with no information back to the user, just saying, unable to submit, we give you a message. That's the first kind of step in graceful failure. It's failed, but we're going to give you some information on where you can update it. Or we can take that a step further and fail even more gracefully and try to correct the form for you. So that's a notion called graceful failure as it pertains to programming. But it dawned on me when we were going through the King of the Hill games around Christianity, and it became clear that really the conflict between, say, secular science and Christianity and maybe more authoritarian religions was a matter of graceful failure. That what humans are doing, we are error trapping based on the resolution of information we have, and then falling back. So if we have high resolution information, we can rely on science and calculation. If we don't have high resolution information, we can fall back on religion, on faith. And then some of those religions may afford a certain amount of calculation, things like maybe a role model to emulate, like virtue, or it can fall back even further into something that is quite authoritarian, just very strict rules to follow. So that's all a matter of graceful failure. So the last few weeks, I've been pushing this idea of graceful failure and these trifectas to say that, like I just said, so for instance, with religion, or for instance, a good example is with theories on ethics, where you have three broad groups of ethics and philosophy. You have consequentialism, you have virtue ethics, and then you have deontic or deontological ethics, which says there is no ontology to ethics, so we should just sort of fall back on the rules that religion has given us because we know it works. So it's the idea of calculating, emulating, and then rule following. And that's a process of graceful failure, that when you have the means of calculating, measuring, and you have high resolution information, you can rely on consequentialism. So you can make your decisions based on a fairly accurate prediction of what the outcomes will be. And then there gets into gray areas on that. You know, you get into justifications as to why you could kill 5 people to save 20. Then there's virtue ethics, which is a set of principles or qualities that one might emulate. And then there's a little bit of calculation in there saying, under this situation, which virtues should I emulate the most? So this becomes rule of thumb based on what we know to work. And then when there is no information or no ability to calculate, there's just hard rules to follow. And then we see this within society, that we have sort of individualism that's prized. Then we have social norms to capture individual behavior that's on the gray areas of the borders of that's threatening high trust. And then we have hard rules in law. These are all methods of graceful failure. Well, these trifectas and this graceful failure, I think, is a great way to get people to start thinking in terms of spectra and operations. Then when we're talking about these 3 states in graceful failure, we're talking about 3 locations on a spectrum. And that what defines that spectrum is a combination of vectors, of operations. So when I was just making the example about consequentialism ethics and deontic ethics, deontology, that the operation behind it is the resolution of information over time. So if you wanted to graph that, you could have where information is low, you rely on rule following. Where information is imperfect, you can rely on rules of thumb. And when information is adequate, you can rely on calculation. So really the operation behind that is a combination of resolution of information and your ability to calculate it. So it becomes a constant, there's a set of constant relations between calculation, resolution of information, and then 3 points on that spectrum. So let me bring up some drawing software and see if I can put that down for you. Let's say we go that there's information from low to high. And then within that spectrum, I'm going to say the bottom axis is over time, and we say as information increases in resolution. So this is where we get into why I said this was going to be clunky. So we can say high res info and low res down here, low res. So let's move this over here and do this properly. And then the 3 points on our spectrum then end up being, in terms of ethics, deontic. Then we can have virtue in the middle. And then we can have consequential over here at high resolution. Okay. So the constant relation here over time is, why won't that move? Here we go. We can say going from left to right, we're moving from low resolution information into high resolution information. So that's based on one vector, one operation. Well, we can do something similar, like if we wanted to get into combinations of constant relations between vectors, and I've done this before. We can say that this is, let's edit this, go male, mate, selection. And that has a certain set of qualities. And then we have, come on now. female mate selection. And that has a different set of qualities. So you could say under this case, where high mate selection is quite high, like where it's more dominant, we have, I'm just going to delete those. We have things like, change this up. We have things like polygamy. So we have harems, essentially. It's not going to move for me. So when we're up here on this side of the spectrum, we're at polygamy. At the opposite end, we have polyandry. So we know what polygamy is. So some might argue that polygamy is the best because it's selecting for the strongest males. Only the best males get to mate. So it has a eugenic quality to it. So we could say that end of the spectrum is highly eugenic. Then we have at the other end, we have polyandry, which is one mother, many fathers. At the other end of the spectrum, and then we can draw some operational conclusions around that. For instance, that maybe it's eugenic for females, or that it's dysgenic in terms of males. And then we can start studying in the spaces between this. What happens when female selection starts to increase as its influence on the population and male selection drops. So we have a situation where, say with gibbons or baboons, females will start soliciting beta males, and beta males will approach them with an apple or a gift of some sort, and the females will sneak away from the alpha and go have sex with them in the trees as long as they keep giving them gifts. So we have this portion where now there's some philandering going on between the girls and the main guy that increases the investment from these beta males. And part of the reason that drives that is under a polygamous grouping like that, there's a lot of infighting between the females to fight for attention and resources from the alpha male. That increases their stress load. So when these sneaky little fuckers come around with their apples, they're willing to exchange sex for resources because it alleviates the frictions around this in-group competition between the females. So we get what evolves there. We get a thing called band of brothers, where the second on the rung of dominant males may then start grouping together, especially if the dominant male is tyrannical. And they'll beat him up, kick him out of the troop. Or in some cases, even the females will do that, but that's a different set. What we say here is that we have female mate selection is now starting to play a factor in their participation with these sneaky little fuckers, which then encourages these males who are also disenfranchised and full of frustration and aggression because they don't have any mating opportunities to band together against the harem leader. So what we get is smaller multiple harems around this band of brothers section. I'll duplicate that again. These band of brothers in the ape world actually are literal brothers. They're males that are raised together. So they may not have the same mother, but it might be troop members that are female troop members that are closer together, that have bonded, and these boys end up being raised together. So they have some desire to protect each other, and that's what forms the band. One will get picked on, the others will jump in to protect their brother. And then these brothers will sort of split the harem. They'll each sort of start getting these official mating opportunities with the females. And what'll happen is that the brothers will police each other. So if there's three brothers, A, B, and C, and A is trying to get with one of the mates of B, C will jump in and discipline them. So you get this mutual assurance of mating opportunities within the band of brothers. And this continues on until you get pair bonding. So we get monogamy in the middle, where now we have males policing sexual opportunity for each other, so they're ensuring sexual opportunity or mating opportunity for each other. Females are now participating in the mate selection because they're choosing from an array of boys that will take care of them, and they essentially sacrifice having the best to having what they can get to alleviate the frictions within the group, and it ends up resulting in the middle of something of monogamy in the middle. And as this continues, and the tribe is successful, their resources increase. And resources at the tribal level and lower are still quite distributive rather than a market. The females start to see the males as competitors for in-group resources. So they actually start selecting for weaker males. And as they continue to select for weaker males, they don't need the community, or they don't need the males for the resources anymore. This is why they're selecting for weaker males. They don't want a male that's too dominant with them, because if they have to compete with them for the resource, they want an equal playing field. As this continues, males fall further down the social rung, and you end up with polygamy, where now it's females offering sex for resources from anybody in the group, and the group is predominantly males that they've mated for that are weaker and more docile. And as that continues, the entire group itself becomes vulnerable, because there are no expendable males to defend the troop. And given that hypergamy is the driving factor behind female solution, stronger males are still more attractive. So if a group with a polygamous group where you have dominant and aggressive males invades this troop, the females flip loyalty almost immediately to the males of the new troop, because now violence is back on the table. It's not about in-group competition anymore. It's about ex-group competition. They look for protection, so they pick the more dominant and aggressive males, and all of this snaps back to the other side of the chart of polygamy. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at polygamy, monogamy, and polyandry as not three distinct strategies where we say, well, one is better than the other for whatever. What we're seeing is that there are strategies that are based on particular conditions. And in this particular case, what's driving those conditions and what's driving the movement along the spectrum is the proportion at which the group is relying on male or female mate selection. Then we can add into that under polyandry, so I'm going to put this over here, I'm going to put another line in here and say that what happens with in areas where there's high monogamy, I need to convert this to a line. Just a second. And make this a curve. Why is it not letting me do a curve? What happens under polygamy, because males are more aggressive than the females, get out of there, and the majority of males don't have mating opportunity, we get a situation where the dominant male has to become very authoritarian. So I'm going to put another vector in here. He has to police the other males to maintain his dominance in the mate selection. So you can say under polygamy, the demand for authority is high. So this is what the red line is. Under polygamy, the demand for authority is high because the alpha male has to keep the this inferior males to him in line. And because they're lacking mate selection, aggression, especially during juvenile stages, is quite high. So that demands a lot of authority from him. And then further to that, you have females that are competing for his attention. So there needs to be some policing on his part, or a second in command within the troop to keep the tensions between the females lower. So you'll have a dominant female that rises within that harem that will police the behavior of the females, because the competition is, the female competition is increasing stresses. So you can say under this situation of polygamy, the demand for authority is high. Then as we move through Band of Brothers and towards monogamy, that authority is distributed. It's a number of males that are ensuring each other's mate selection. There's less aggression between them because they now all have mating choices. The females are not competing as much with the in-group because they all have their own independent sources of resources, until we land at something like monogamy, where it has the lowest demand for authority because there's self-policing going on. Then as I said, as prosperity increases and there starts to be in-group competition for resources across both males and females, we start to see those tensions rise again, and we see a breakdown of authority. There isn't the one single superior man, and the males are weaker. We start moving into a hierarchy of the females, and now it's about redistribution of resources, which then increases the demand for authority again. So in this case, if we put this into a modern context, when we move from monogamy into polyandry, we're moving from women seeking resources from a mate, a husband, to seeking resources from the state. So that increases their demand for state welfare programs. So that increases the demand for dominance or authority of the state over private matters. Okay, so now we have three constant relations here. We have the relationship between male and female selection, but now we also have demand for authority mapped on top of that. So then we can do this again. Let's duplicate this. Let's flip it around like so, and we'll make this green like so. The other thing that happens here is that under polygamy, because there's a lot of female competition and there isn't a lot of male bonding with offspring, there's a decreased investment in offspring. So now this is going to skew to a whole bunch of other things, like polygamy is more appropriate under high predation pressure. High predation pressure has a hormone effect to change mating strategy to mate early and often, and have a lower time in which you invest in the children, which then increases the speed at which they mature, which increases impulsivity. There's a whole bunch of other things here, but let's just say under polygamy, because there's low investment from the male in the offspring, and there's increased tension on the female, so they can't afford to invest a lot of time into their children. They send the children off early so that puts them back into a position where they can offer sex to the alpha again. So investment in offspring is low. And then as we move into a band of brothers, there's less in-group competition between the females. There's more resources being gathered by those band of brothers. That offers more time from the females to invest in the offspring. And the males have greater proximity to the offspring, so it encourages male bonding with the offspring. All of that increases investment in the offspring, in the children. And then we move out of monogamy back into polyandry, where now you have many fathers, one mother, where there's less bonding with the male. The males are disposable, so they move in and out depending on what resources they can bring, which brings instability around the resources, which then encourages looking to the greater community for redistribution, which again starts to lower the investment in children again. Okay, so this is an example of what I mean by we quite often have a number of points on a spectrum, and we approach them as though they're discrete entities that are independent of each other. We treat them like they're objects, like they're nouns, when they're not. They're a state within a series of changes, a steady state. So what's underneath polygamy, monogamy, and polyandry is a set of operations that move and change in relation to each other, so what we call a constant relation, and that you can have multiple dimensions of constant relations behind a phenomenon. So if you don't understand the spectrum, the span of the spectrum, and you don't understand where the spectrum begins and ends, in other words, where those operations are possible or not, we can get locked into only looking at one spot on the graph and say, only that's important, or only this is important. And we can say, you know, polygamy is awesome because it's eugenic and you get the strongest, best males, and then they pass those genes on to both the females and males. So that's awesome. We want that. We want only the guy that can afford to support 6 wives and have 23 children to be the ones that mate. We don't want anybody else mating. Or you can say polyandry is awesome. It's liberal, it's egalitarian. The notion of traditional roles are oppressive to personal agency anyways. I can draw that back into the presumptions that evolve out of monogamy into why they believe that, they argue that. Or you can argue that monogamy is the best. But by doing that, you're arguing false dichotomies and false trichotomies. It's once the operations are understood, you can say, okay, yes, it is eugenic, but it also drops investment in offspring. So how many of those better offspring are actually surviving? And then if they are surviving, and because there is a lower investment in them, to what degree is their genetic potential being realized? And then given that it's a high stressful situation, what hormonal effects does it have on that child? Is it increasing impulsivity? Is it decreasing things that we know lead to things like machine language? And then we can look at monogamy and say, well, this is awesome because it's high investment in children, and high investment in children develops stronger individuals, which create more competent, more civilized populations. So it drops the the demand for authority, and this is awesome. But it's also not eugenic. So you can end up growing an underclass that's causing a lot of social frictions, right? So then you can start to see the benefits and downsides of each, and then in understanding what's causing the movement left and right over the spectrum, we can start deciding or understanding what kind of restrictions that we can put in place to achieve the optimum. Okay, and then that optimum is also going to be relative to what conditions that you're talking about. So Northern Europeans tend to do better under low authority because they have low power index. But that same social structure does not work very well in the Middle East. The Middle East does better under a high power index. So they operate better under authority, and they operate better with polygamy. So if you're saying, you know, democracy and capitalism and monogamy for all, and then we run around the world trying to get everybody else to live this way and then find it constantly fails. Well, it's constantly failing because of the population that you're moving into and the geographic and resource profile that they live within. So you can start to understand, well, no, this doesn't work for them. Maybe they do need to have high authority and high polygamy. Well, what understanding that, what kind of constraints that we would put on there to make that manageable, that would increase the survivability of that group. And then over time, maybe that temperament will change, or maybe those conditions will change. And we don't want to have a system in place that locks them into only that one position. So you start to see that if you have a value neutral, we're not saying one is better over the other, or by what criteria. When you have a value neutral understanding of the operations underneath these points on the spectrum, we can now do something from it. It gives us higher resolution information and a more accurate means of calculating and predicting. Okay, so, excuse me. So the idea that I had over the last couple of weeks is that graceful failure is really a means of getting people to think in this way. Graceful failure doesn't work very well with polygamy, monogamy, and polyandry, because it's not like we have polyandry and then we fall back on monogamy. What we do is we have polyandry that abruptly falls back into high polygamy, but only after the entire social organization has collapsed or been invaded. So this is a good example of constant relations, but not a good example of graceful failure. So saying that demonstrates that graceful failure and constant relations or spectra are not the same thing, but that graceful failure is a good way of training your thinking around spectrums and constant relations. So we can go back to the one that we had before. We can say deontic, we can say virtue ethics, and we can say consequentialism. Voila. And we can say now that it's not a matter of mate selection, but it's high res and low res on one line, high res info, and we can go down here and go low res info. Come on, there we go. Low res info. Now this will be our information line, high and low, left to right. But what we can do here is we can say that this other one is intuition. We can say high intuition on this end, up here, or faith, you can say, and we can say high calculation. And that what an increase in resolution and information does, gives us a means of calculating. And when we have low information, we rely on intuition or faith. No information. And then what we can do is we can break this line so that it's no longer a matter of time. I'm going to put that down there. I'm going to put that down there. And I could actually put faith and science if you wanted to. Now this isn't moving through time. So now we're not saying as we move through time and gain higher resolution information, say the shift from observation into science, we can say that we have high intuition in a society that has low resolution information and means of calculation. We have a high reliance on intuition. Whereas if you're in a society that has a lot of means of calculating, so we have things like science, a lot of processes of doing that, we have low faith, high calculation. Okay, so we can say that this is now a different set of vectors. All right. And then that too also tends to skew with demand for authority and other vectors as well. You can start mapping things over top of that. But what I want to get you thinking now is that we have two dimensions, the resolution of information and the means of digesting that information from intuitive into calculation. Now we can start looking at this as though it's a surface rather than a graph. It's a surface, and we can add in another dimension to this that's like elevation. So think of looking at a topological map where you have, if you had a mountaintop, you have these rings that tell you the elevation, or you have just the opposite where it tells you that there's low spaces. Duplicate. where there's high spaces like this. And we can start mapping a third dimension on top of this. Instead of graphing it over time, we can graph a space like a landscape of what happens when you have low resolution information, high intuition. Well, do we ever get a situation where we have high resolution and high intuition? Well, that would be fast thinking, I guess. Or do we have a situation where we have calculation with very low resolution? Well, that would, I guess, kind of be your deontic ethics, where the ethics have, the rules have been calculated and then codified or institutionalized. But I don't want to get into that too much. I don't want to add in another dimension. I just want to say, if you approach this as though it's a map, a topographical map, we can map time through a vector through it. And we can say, well, you know, England 1,000 years ago was still pretty low in mapping out information, so it was still based on the church, but it had a little bit more than just blind faith. There was some Aristotelianism, there's folk knowledge, and so on. And then over time, it moved up to this high resolution, high calculation standpoint. So it's like well over here, you know, kind of where we are. And then we can say, now the next stage is now, as we return back by adopting grammars of disambiguation, which reduces our means to calculation, we're moving back to sort of an intuition somewhere down here. So let me get this thing up over here somewhere. We can start mapping out time. And the time isn't a straight line. It's sort of a movement across this map, like a trail through the woods. And then you can compare that to another society where, say, we had, let me get this over here. We could say that maybe there's Islam right down at the very end, and then they moved into an adoption of Aristotelianism over here during their golden age, and then they've moved abruptly back over the last little while, abruptly back into intuition, right? And then we can actually even color the map now. Let's see if I can do that. I can color this map. Let's go with gradients of something here. Just bear with me for a second. Where's my fill? I don't have my fill in here. Just make it red. We'll give it a transparency so that you can see through it, and we can go, sorry, there's a series of controls for the screen recording that blocks a lot of what I can do here, so I gotta move stuff around. Other properties, that's not what I want. I want to fill. Go into fountain fill, and I'm going to say it's red at one end, and I'm going to say it's green at the other, and I'm going to put it on an angle. I'm going to put this on a 45-degree angle. So we can map a whole other series here where, let me put this down below. Bring it up slowly. There we go. And make this darker so you can see it. We'll make it blue. We can say that the colors now relate to, again, a demand for authority. Or we can say reliance on discretionary rule over calculated rule of law. And then we can say they had discretionary theological law. It moved into a golden age where there were some rights and some, you know, limitations on slavery and so on, and then they moved back into an authoritarian stance today. We can start mapping a number of dimensions this way, and that time isn't linear, it's a movement across this map. And you can say, well, if we continue down the path that we're on, you know, we can maybe end up somewhere where this country was a few years ago. All right, this is just to illuminate that operationalism and constant relations being multidimensional, we can bring them in and start mapping them over top of each other. So we're doing it here as, you know, a surface and over a couple dimensions. That really proprietarian arguments are like that. So when people are consuming the product of P, they've got a set of arguments that might be in a particular context. So we can argue for why ANACAP is wrong based on a few of those vectors. We can talk about the necessity of rule of law, the necessity of creating a geographic area, so the necessity of sovereignty. But we can also talk about all of those things based on trust matrix, or we can talk about all those things based on temperamental changes and as they skew with conditions, or we can talk about it in terms of genetics, or we can talk about it in terms of history. So I've said a few times that these P concepts, when you have the argument down pat, and then you start to realize just how much research and data is behind it. This is what I'm talking about. The consumption of the product doesn't really illuminate the depth and degree of operations that undergird that product. And if you can start to think in terms of operations and understanding the operations behind that argument, you'll start to see how arguments overlap. So the wrap-up video that I did, I talked about how there's this interconnectedness between reciprocity and property and testimonialism and sovereignty and trust as a commons. All of these things are interwoven because there's a common operational thread behind them. And in that particular case, that was trust. And that trust is sincerity and reliability. And that property gives you a means of calculating reciprocity. So that provides a reliability which helps maintain trust and so on. You can have all of these vectors underneath it. So as you start to accumulate an operational understanding of these arguments, it starts to fill in holes of things that appear to be completely separate, completely discrete things. So that when you start encountering these new sets of arguments, they're much easier to adopt because you already have some of the foundation that undergirds them already in place. And then as you start collecting more and more arguments, the picture fills out more and more until really the only thing lacking is the general knowledge of the data underneath it. So you can understand conceptually. So first you can understand the arguments, the logic behind it, and then you can understand the operations underneath it. But then at some point, the only real limitation is the data underneath it. Because you have to think that when we give you a proprietarian argument, the details have already been fleshed out. And when you encounter it, it's like, oh, that's pretty simple. But imagine if you didn't have any of those operations in place. How would you ever come to them? It's terribly difficult because there's so many data points to consider. So how do we crack that open and say, okay, we got 3 discrete points here. People are arguing against each other with them. There's got to be some sort of operational spectra underneath it, but I can't see it. Well, that's why I'm trying to introduce the idea of graceful failure as maybe a way of falling into it and say, what is it that is going on here? So when we talk about ethics from consequentialism through to deontics, we can pull on Vitruvianism and say, okay, well, what are people doing when they're doing consequentialism? What are people doing when they're doing deontics? So you say, well, there's a person confronted with a situation. What is that situation? Well, that situation is a number of data points that they must react or act accordingly, given that data constellation, that fact pattern. So under deontics, is it because they don't understand the fact pattern, they just rely on rules? So now you're starting to see, okay, they're responding to responding to a situation based on a set of rules is maybe because they don't have enough information to calculate. So you start to see underneath these discrete points that there are similarities in operations. So I've done this with truth theory. So if you watch What is Truth and going, well, is there really a difference between say, abject logic, deductive logic, inference, and then it became clear that each of these different models of inference are are related to where you are on a spectrum of free association to create a hypothesis, and then from the hypothesis to collect data, and then from the data to analyze the data, and until you have a new fleshed out predictive model. So they're not at odds at each other. It's not that it's deductive versus inductive, and it's not that abject is a complete waste of time. Abject logic is like free association. It's perfectly appropriate when you're doing hypothesis creation. So the idea of abject is to say, I hit a pool ball, the ball hits the 9 ball and goes in the pocket. The cue ball must have moved the 9 ball. You're just sort of guessing. You're drawing things together based on sort of very crude observations. And then from doing that, looking at these different means of inference means that these different theories on truth are not unrelated from each other, that maybe they rest on a spectrum, and that spectrum could be imperial on one side, where it's all about the external information, so it's correspondence on one side, and then on the other side it could be all about construction, internal construction models, mental models. And then you find underneath that there's a biology behind that. We have a sensory system that is processing information multidimensionally, that eventually reaches a frontal lobe that has this feedback loop of creating a model and then testing it back against the sensory inputs, and then updating the model, and continuously doing this, that we're constantly doing searches and updates to those searches until we hit pattern matching. So really, when we're talking about people that are heavily idealistic or Platonistic, it's because they might have a physical predilection to the frontal lobe over sensory data. And people that are more highly imperial might be relying more, have a predilection to land on search testing data against the model. So they might not be terribly great at creating new models, but they might be very good at testing the validity of a model. And then there are others that don't have that model processing thing developed as well. So they want to keep life very clean and clear cut and simple, sort of objectivist. It's just very clear cut, simple rules of the world. So now we're taking truth theories, which is completely different from biology, but then we start to see that there's a relationship there. It's the internal, external, or the predictive versus sensory relationship, a constant relationship there, which has empiricism on one end, has profundity or experience on the other, and in the middle is really a matter of coherence. Is what's happening in the experience coherent to what is happening in the world, right? Because all of our understanding is a mix of that. There's the correspondent information, but then there's the meaning that we create out of it. So some people are meaning-making machines, and other people are fact-driven machines, fact-processing machines. So this is what the power of operational thinking is. Okay, so what do we cover off? Graceful failure is a great way of starting to understand how to think operationally, or maybe to build up that intuition. The key to graceful failure is to ask yourself, what is the common processes that are going on here? So that'll go back to eprime, about looking at how things exist and what those effects are. And Vitruvianism is another one in terms of human interactions. That can then crack open the nut on what the actual operations are. When the operations are in place, then you can start understanding where the limits are. So in this case, if you have high resolution on information, the opposite limit would be low resolution information. If you have low ability to calculate on one end, high ability to calculate on the other. So that sets the limits of the spectrum. And then say, okay, what are the points on the spectrum? What are the identifiable states within a consistent set of changes? What are the steady states in between here? And one insight in terms of understanding where the states begin and end is arguments about boundary layer levels, because quite often our categories at the boundary seem somewhat arbitrary. We just sort of make up a boundary and say to the left of this is red and to the right of that is orange. And if you look at the boundary layers, that will start to give some insight as to where the operations are. And then if you can map it out, you can see how multiple relations move in sequence together. They move in predictable patterns. And then once that's mapped out, you can verify that through data or through argumentation with other people to get more insight as to, is this actually true? Is what I'm seeing actually accurate? And then flesh out your argument on it, flesh out your knowledge of it. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for now. I'm hoping at some point to maybe do a Q&A on this. I initially asked for Scott and Daniel to be on board, partly because I was covering off these ideas with Scott in the threads on the group, but also in private conversations. And Daniel did his eprime, and he's right there. It's right at the point where he could operationalize it. I can tell that in the language when he primed it, but it's just like one more step. And he picked a really hard example to work with because it was more creative writing than descriptive writing. So maybe next week, think about this for the week, and then maybe next week what we'll do is we'll do a QA on operationalism and eprime, and then just open it up back to a discussion. Okay? Love you all. Thanks for popping by, for those who watched, and I hope this is helpful for you.